Do you know what GDPR is and why it's important? Let's dive into it. GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation, is a regulation in European Union law that focuses on data protection and privacy, both within the European Union and the European Economic Area. It also regulates the transfer of personal data outside these regions. This legislation isn't new. It officially became enforceable on May 25, 2018. But don't let its age fool you. The regulation's relevance and impact have only grown since its inception as our world becomes increasingly digital and data-driven. But what does the regulation aim to achieve? At its core, the regulation was designed to give individuals control over their personal data. It seeks to simplify the regulatory environment for international business by unifying the regulation within the EU. This simplification doesn't mean lax rules, though. Instead, the regulation imposes stricter data handling and security protocols, enhancing privacy and data protection for all EU citizens. Under the regulation, personal data is any information related to an identifiable individual. Processing covers any operation performed on this personal data, be it collection, storage, or use. The data subject is the individual whose data is processed, while the data controller is the entity that determines the purposes, conditions, and means of the processing. The data processor, on the other hand, is the entity that processes data on behalf of the data controller. The scope of the regulation is vast. It applies not only to organizations operating within the EU, but also to organizations outside the EU that offer goods or services to individuals in the EU. It covers both digital and paper records, reinforcing its comprehensive approach to data protection. The regulation stands on 7 key principles: lawfulness, fairness and transparency, purpose limitation, data minimization, accuracy, storage limitation, integrity and confidentiality, which is security and accountability. The regulation, the European Union has set a new standard for data protection and privacy. It's a critical regulation to understand and follow, especially for any organization dealing with the data of EU citizens. So what are the objectives of GDPR? At the heart of the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, is the goal of reshaping the way organizations approach data privacy. But let's dive a bit deeper into its primary objectives. First and foremost, this regulation is about giving individuals or data subjects control over their personal data. This means you and me, as individuals, have the right to access our data, correct inaccuracies, and even have our data erased in certain circumstances. It's about ensuring that we are not just passive recipients of data collection, but active participants in how our personal information is used. Secondly, this regulation aims to simplify the regulatory environment for international business. Prior to this regulation, each member state in the European Union had its own set of data protection laws. This made it quite complicated for businesses operating across borders. With this regulation, there is now a unified regulation within the EU, making it easier for international businesses to comply and operate. Thirdly, this regulation enhances privacy and data protection for all EU citizens. It does so by imposing strict rules on those hosting and processing this data anywhere in the world. It's not just about collecting data, but also about how that data is stored, used, and shared. Lastly, this regulation imposes stricter data handling and security protocols. It mandates organizations to take a proactive approach to data security. Whether it's encrypting personal data, ensuring confidentiality, or conducting regular security assessments, organizations are required to show they're doing everything they can to protect personal data. In a world where data is often referred to as the new oil, this regulation is pioneering a shift in perspective, viewing data not as a commodity, but as an extension of the individual. It's about acknowledging that when we talk about data, we're talking about people's lives, their privacy, and their rights. In essence, this regulation is about giving power back to the individuals over their personal data. Before we delve deeper, it's important to understand some key terms related to GDPR. Up, we have personal data. This refers to any information related to an identifiable individual. It could be something as simple as your name or email address, or as complex as your medical history or financial records. Next, we have processing. This term covers any operation performed on personal data. It might be collection, storage, use, or even deletion. If you're doing anything with personal data, you're processing it. Moving on, we come to the data subject. This is the individual whose personal data is being processed. So, if a company is storing your email address, you are the data subject. Then we have the data controller. This is the entity that determines the purposes, conditions, and means of the processing of personal data. They're the ones calling the shots, deciding what data to collect, how to use it, and who can access it. And we have the data processor. This is the entity that processes data on behalf of the data controller. They might be a third party, like a cloud service provider or a marketing agency. To give you a real-world example, let's imagine you're shopping online. You, the customer, are the data subject. The online store is the data controller as they decide what information to collect from you and how to use it. And the company that hosts the store's website could be the data processor, handling your data on behalf of the store. These are the building blocks of this law. They help us understand who is involved in data processing, what their roles are, and how personal data should be handled. As you can see, this law is not just about data, it's about people and how their data is handled. This legislation has a broad scope that extends beyond the borders of EU. The General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, is not just an EU regulation. Its reach extends far beyond the borders of the European Union. Whether your organization is based in the heart of Paris or nestled in the hills of California, if you process the personal data of individuals in the EU, you're within this legislation's scope. But wait, let's clarify what we mean by processing. In the context of this legislation, processing includes any operation performed on personal data, be it collection, storage, use, or even deletion. So as long as you're dealing with the personal data of individuals in the EU, you're under the umbrella of this legislation. Now, you might be wondering, what about organizations that aren't based in the EU, but offer goods or services to individuals in the EU? Well, they're covered too. This legislation applies to them in the same way it applies to organizations operating within the EU. This means that even if your organization is based in a country that doesn't have strict data protection laws, if you are dealing with the personal data of EU individuals, you must comply with this legislation. And it's not just digital data we're talking about. This legislation covers both digital and paper records. That's right. Even if you're storing data in old-school filing cabinets, you're still accountable under this legislation. This is a regulation that takes a comprehensive approach to data protection. Now, it's important to remember that this legislation is not just about compliance, it's about fostering trust and transparency. It's about giving individuals control over their personal data and ensuring their privacy is respected. By complying with this legislation, organizations not only avoid hefty fines, but also build trust with their customers and stakeholders. So, in summary, this legislation's scope is broad and all-encompassing. It applies to organizations operating within the EU and those outside the EU that offer goods or services to individuals in the EU. It covers both digital and paper records. This legislation is a global regulation impacting organizations worldwide that deal with EU citizens' data. These rules are built on 7 key principles. Let's dive into these principles that form the core of the General Data Protection Regulation. First up is lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. This principle emphasizes that personal data must be processed lawfully, fairly, and in a transparent manner. It's all about open and honest communication between organizations and individuals about how data is used. Next, we have purpose limitation. This means that personal data must be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes. In other words, organizations can't just collect data willy-nilly. They need to have a clear, valid reason for doing so. Moving on to data minimization. This principle mandates that personal data should be adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary. It encourages businesses to collect only the data they need, nothing more, nothing less. Fourth on the list is accuracy. Under these rules, personal data must be accurate and, where necessary, kept up to date. This puts the onus on organizations to ensure that the information they hold is correct and current. Comes the principle of storage limitation. This refers to the idea that personal data should be kept in a form which permits identification of data subjects for no longer than is necessary. So organizations can't keep data indefinitely. They must have a set time frame for data retention. The principle is integrity and confidentiality, often referred to as security. This principle states that personal data must be processed in a manner that ensures appropriate security, including protection against unauthorized or unlawful processing, accidental loss, destruction, or damage. Finally, we have accountability. This principle makes it clear that organizations must take responsibility for the data they hold and how they handle it. They must be able to demonstrate compliance with all the principles of these rules. These principles form the backbone of these rules, guiding how personal data should be managed and protected. These aren't just rules to follow, but a philosophy that prioritizes respect for individual privacy and data security. You may be wondering why GDPR matters. Well, let's dive right into it. Imagine a world where data is the new gold and digital platforms are the new gold mines. In this, your personal data is constantly being processed, transferred, and stored by numerous entities, often without your explicit knowledge or consent. Sounds a bit unsettling, doesn't it? That's where this directive steps in. Primarily, this directive sets a high standard for data protection across the globe. By ensuring that organizations handle personal data with utmost care and respect, this directive not only safeguards the rights of individuals, but also creates a level playing field for businesses. It encourages a culture of transparency and accountability, pushing organizations to take data protection seriously and invest in robust security measures. The potential consequences of non-compliance are another key reason why this directive matters. Organizations that fail to meet the requirements of this directive can face heavy fines and penalties. Not talking about pocket change here, fines can go up to 20 million euros or 4% of the company's global annual turnover, whichever is higher. This acts as a strong deterrent, nudging businesses to prioritize data protection. But it's not all about penalties and fines. This directive plays a crucial role in enhancing trust and security in the digital economy. In an era where data breaches and privacy scandals have become all too common, this directive provides assurance to individuals that their data will be handled responsibly. This fosters trust between consumers and businesses, which is a vital ingredient for a thriving digital economy. Lastly, this impacts nearly every organization that processes the data of EU residents, regardless of where they are based. This broad territorial scope means that this directive's influence reaches far beyond the borders of the European Union, making it a globally significant regulation. So, in a nutshell, this directive is more than just a rule book for data handling. It's a monumental shift in how we view and respect personal data. This directive is more than just a regulation, it's a commitment to respect and protect personal data. Let's summarize what we've learned about GDPR. The General Data Protection Regulation, or this policy as it's commonly known, is a critical piece of legislation in EU law. It's all about data protection and privacy for individuals within the European Union and the European Economic Area. But it doesn't stop there. It also covers the transfer of personal data outside these areas. Since May 25th, 2018, this policy has been actively enforceable. The main aim of this policy is to put individuals back in control of their personal data. It also seeks to simplify the regulatory environment for international business by unifying the regulation within the EU. This policy enhances privacy, imposes stricter data handling protocols, and reinforces the importance of data protection for EU citizens. We've talked about several key terms in this policy. Personal data is any information related to an identifiable individual. Processing refers to any operation performed on personal data, be it collection, storage, use, or something else. The data subject is the individual whose personal data is being processed. The data controller decides the purposes, conditions, and means of the data processing, while the data processor carries out the processing on behalf of the controller. This policy's reach is wide. It applies to organizations operating within the EU and to organizations outside the EU offering goods or services to individuals residing in the EU. It covers both digital and paper records. This operates on 7 key principles: lawfulness, fairness, transparency, purpose limitation, data minimization, accuracy, storage limitation, and accountability. These principles ensure the integrity, confidentiality, and security of personal data. Finally, this policy matters. It sets a high global standard for data protection. Non-compliance can lead to heavy fines and penalties. It fosters trust and security in the digital economy and impacts nearly every organization processing EU residents' data. Understanding this policy is crucial for any organization dealing with the data of EU citizens. It's not just about compliance, but about fostering trust and respect for personal data.